that he says, "Tell me what you accuse the Jews of. I'll tell you what you're guilty of." His recognition that it is everywhere and always a form of projection, and that the anti-Semite tells us nothing about the Jews, but everything about themselves. So Grossman gives the example, for instance, of the fact that the Nazis accused the Jews of being racist and wanting to take over the world. uh, yes, that's the Nazis telling us everything about themselves. I don't want to walk with a crowd. Like, I don't want, I don't need or desire to walk in lockstep with a crowd.
Blood cults in designer suits, elites cheering death like it's halftime, and a West so guilty it launders sins on the Jews. Douglas Murray torches it all. From Hamas billionaires to Princeton cosplay revolutions, from Grossman's buried truths to the left's unholy alliances. This isn't commentary, it's a scalpel. Brace yourself. What if our moral outrage is just projection in disguise?
Of course, all sorts of death cults throughout history have had that misguided belief, the people who will never tire of other people's blood,
Well, I think Hamas says this in their protocols. They mention this.
Yeah,
They we have to take them seriously. No.
Yeah, it's in the charter, it's in everything. And one of the interesting things that will have to be addressed at some point in Israel is why there was a misconception that Hamas were by 2023, in a position that so many fanatical groups have been in history, which is that they had lost interest in their original fanaticism and just wanted to enjoy being corrupt. And of course, that is very interesting because that has been a story of many fanatical movements. I mean, one thinks of the 1980s in Soviet Russia, where, nobody believed it anymore. It obviously didn't work, but the elites, as it were, in Russian society, in the Communist Party, were willing to just keep the thing going, and they would enjoy the benefits of corruption at the top echelons of society and just have a nice time. Why there was such a misconception in parts of Israeli society and intelligence, military, government, maybe, is a big question, because of course Hamas showed that you can be both corrupt and fanatical and really mean it, and put everything on the line, including your whole society, Gaza, in order to achieve your fanatical end goals. So it's not just that they're happy being, making the Hamas leadership, as I said, mentioned in the book, all billionaires.
Blood cults don't retire. They just get rich and keep killing. Murray rips the fantasy that Hamas mellowed into corrupt fat cats. No, they're billionaires and zealots. Israel misread them like a drunk gambler misreading the table. Think Soviet elites. Decay masked as ideology, except Hamas fuses greed with holy war. Fanaticism plus money equals apocalypse math. So tell me, how the hell do you negotiate with that?
One interpretation would have been, well, maybe they're happy just being billionaires, living in Qatar in luxury penthouses, and they'll shed the fanaticism. But the fanaticism wasn't shed. It was what they wanted to do. That's why Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, is such a sort of crucial figure in this book, and of course in the wider story, because he was the fanatic's fanatic, a total pathological psychopath who sought to bring death in its most gruesome forms, and that's one of the reasons why he's so fascinating. Because as I quote in the book as well, that's, I think we could probably say with some certainty that Sinwar was a psychopath, but what he worked on was to create a society of sociopaths.
But just realize the juxtaposition. That's the same Sinwar whose life was saved in an Israeli prison, but a dentist noticed a growth in his brain and saved his life eventually. Just the juxtaposition right there.
It's such a painful story, that one, because yes, the dentist in the prison where Sinwar was in the 2000s, where he was in prison, in Israeli prison, as you know, for killing Palestinians with his own hands. Um, and yes, his conversations with the dentist in the prison, who is the one who identifies that he's stumbling when he's getting up for prayers and so on, and realizes it's probably a brain tumor, sends him off to an Israeli hospital where his life is saved. And yes, and as it happened, that man who saved his life had a nephew in near Oz on the 7th who was murdered by Sinwar's forces. It's all so horribly close and tied up everywhere, isn't it?
Hamas leaders sipping lattes in Qatar while plotting massacres. People thought wealth kills fanaticism, but with Sinwar, it sharpened it. Murray calls him the fanatic's fanatic, a psychopath engineering a society of sociopaths. And irony spits in our face. Israel once saved his life. The dentist who spotted his tumour, his nephew was later slaughtered by Sinwar's men. What bigger proof do you need that mercy doesn't tame monsters?
It really is. Yeah. So we have the front, the death cult front from Hamas and their friends. But we also have that alliance between the death cult and the left. Some call it that red-green alliance. We saw it spill out on the campuses over the last year and a half at Columbia and Harvard and other places. We see Greta Thunberg, who is a proponent of a greener world, yet she unites with the Islamic fundamentalists. So how is it possible that people who proclaim to fight on behalf of the victims adopt the philosophy of the murderers? Is this the madness of crowds that you write about in your book?
It's an astonishing one, this, and I mean it'll be a long time till it's fully unwrapped, if it's ever unwrapped. Yes, how did a part of a youth generation which had been brought up on, believe all women, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and so on, how did they come across Hamas and decide to side with Hamas and not the victims of Hamas? Why did they adopt wholesale the Hamas sort of worldview to the extent of dressing as Hamas, covering their heads in kaffirs and terrorist chic? And how is it that, for instance, at Princeton University the other day, once again, students were chanting by the hundreds, "Glory to our martyrs"? I mean, this is a totally imported ideology.
Climate kids, feminist warriors, woke activists, supposed defenders of victims, marching arm in arm with death cult fanatics. Murray calls it what it is, the Red-Green Alliance, a grotesque marriage of radical left and Islamist zealots. Imagine chanting, "Believe all women one day and the next," glorifying men who stoned them. At Princeton, elites in training cheer martyrs like it's a football game. How does victim culture worship the victimizers?
What is our in that chant? Why our martyrs? Maybe if you were a Palestinian born in Gaza, it's understandable if you start to talk about our martyrs. But what would the so-called martyrs in Hamas have to do with the hour of students at Princeton University, other than that they've decided to throw themselves full scale into a conflict about which they know nothing and side with the people who started it? I think there are very, very dark things going on in this. And inevitably, some people think it's anti-Semitism or just anti-Semitism. I think it's a lot more than that. I think that the vacuum that you write about in your book on Frankel, among other things, I think that vacuum that many young people at elite institutions are feeling has been filled up by the worst ideology of all. I mean, there are many answers to meaninglessness in life, but to decide to find meaning in a group that is explicitly in favor of death for others and for itself plays to some of the darkest parts of the human psyche.
Yes, we're seeing it. We're seeing the id revealed, or the thanatos revealed.
Okay.
Frankel warned about this prophetically 75, 80 years ago.
Yes.
He said, unlike the Viennese culture, which was dealing more with sexual repression, that was let out of the box by Freud, he said that the greatest challenge facing humanity would be the lack of meaning. He called it the existential vacuum. And
Yes.
you are indeed correct, Douglas. I believe that that's what we're watching at now is as the emptiness increases, things like even Hamas can slip in. The death cult philosophy and psychology slips in, you know.
Princeton kids shouting our martyrs. Martyrs from a war they've never fought, for a cause they don't even grasp. Murray nails it. This isn't solidarity. It's a symptom of a deeper rot, an existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl warned, strip life of meaning, and people will worship death just to feel alive. And now, the elite's emptiness births kafir cosplay. Isn't it terrifying that privilege breeds nihilism?
But let's talk about, perhaps there is some type, if we do a Venn diagram and we see the, you know, what they share, these two movements. Let's talk about anti-Semitism for a few moments. You have a remarkable theory that I've never really heard before. And you quote in your books and in some of your speeches about a fellow named Vasily Grossman. He was a fantastic Russian writer, journalist, and so on. How did you discover this obscure figure in Jewish history and rely on him for your theories? How did you find out about him?
Oh, I don't think he's obscure, Vasily Grossman, but he certainly hasn't yet got the renown he deserves. His work took a long time to be translated into English, and we almost didn't have his masterpiece, Life and Fate, because the Soviet authorities did not want to see it published. I learned about Grossman some 25 years ago, actually, from a Persian writer friend of mine, who I remember, she, sadly no longer with us, she said to me that there were only two great novels of the 20th century, The Leopard of Giuseppe de Lampedusa, obviously, and Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. And this friend was a very strict literary critic, and she also had a very funny rule, by the way, which was that nobody should be allowed to publish books that were over 250 pages. We said, if you have something to say, you can say it in under 300 pages, you know. But the fact that she recommended this 900-page novel suggested to me that this was indeed something to contend with. It took me many years actually to get around to it, but I realized that Life and Fate, which is about the midnight of the 20th century, of Grossman, who covered the Battle of Stalingrad as a journalist, and also was the first journalist into Treblinka, and who, in an extraordinary piece, which I refer to in the book, described what happened in Treblinka. He was one of the first people to piece it together.
Murray drags out a weapon most campuses wouldn't recognise if it smacked them in the face. Vasily Grossman. Not obscure, just inconvenient. Soviet censors tried to bury Life and Fate because it exposed both Nazi gas chambers and Stalinist gulags as branches of the same poisoned tree. Grossman saw Stalingrad's carnage, then Treblinka's ashes, and concluded evil isn't a glitch of one system. It's humanity's default when ideology rules. Grossman hits the nerve no one dares touch.
So this was a writer who really understood the midnight of the 20th century. And yes, and I was just blown away some years ago when I read it by the fact that this extraordinary descriptive novel, a sort of 20th century War and Peace, I suppose, is one of the ways it might be described, that at the very midnight of the novel, the middle of the novel, he takes 4 pages out from the narrative to address the question of anti-Semitism. And I was blown away by it because it's so good. I mean, he says almost everything. Anti-Semitism obviously is an extremely, sadly, rich subject, and there's been a lot said and written about it. But he says almost everything that needs to be said about it. And also, it was so structurally striking to me that this was the only way he could do it, was to like pause the narrative and then address this question. And of course, you know, he makes the observation there that I've been trying to make more widely known, more popular, which is the suggestion that he says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. His recognition that it is everywhere and always a form of projection and that the anti-Semite tells us nothing about the Jews, but everything about themselves. So Grossman gives the example, for instance, of the fact that the Nazis accused the Jews of being racist and wanting to take over the world. Yes, that's the Nazis telling us everything about themselves. And but I thought about that a lot, and I thought, well, I know what, if Grossman's rule holds, as I think it does, I know what other countries are doing.
Anti-Semitism isn't about Jews at all. It's a mirror showing the rot of the accuser. Nazis screamed Jews were racist and world-dominating while building a racist empire bent on world domination. Murray weaponizes this rule like a scalpel. Tell me your accusations, I'll map your crimes. Doesn't that make today's slogans look like confessions in disguise?
I know that when Erdogan in Turkey describes the Jewish state as being an occupying state, he's describing himself, because he still, and his country still occupies northern Cyprus. So I knew that. I knew that with the Ayatollahs in Iran, they accuse Israel of being a colonialist state because they're busily colonizing the Middle East from Yemen to Lebanon and elsewhere. I knew that worked with them. But the thing that I was thinking about a lot as I was watching the derangement of Western societies outside Israel the last couple of years was what's then going on with the people on the streets and in the elite institutions? What are they doing? And that's when I realized that of course, the set of accusations that were being made against Israel were all very familiar, and not just from the history of the demonization of Israel, but they were all very familiar because Israel was being accused everywhere and always of being racist, colonialist, white supremacist, genocide.
Every few weeks, it seems to change. They add another epithet. There's another description.
And you know, that it's engaged in ethnic cleansing and always has been, and so on. And I thought, well, these are all things I've written about in previous books as being, these are the totemic accusations of our time. To accuse somebody of these things, or a society of these things, is to accuse it of the worst things, and certainly the worst things in our idiom. And then, of course, I realized that, well, these are all the familiar accusations, but they're also the things that people in the West have been told that we are guilty of. To be born in 21st century America is to be told that you are responsible for slavery and colonialism. And if you grew up in Britain in the last 30, 40 years, you will have been told that you were responsible for slavery, colonialism, ethnic cleansing.
Murray flips the table. Erdogan calls Israel occupier while squatting in northern Cyprus. Iran screams colonialist while puppeteering Yemen and Lebanon. Projection, plain and filthy. Western kids chanting genocide at Israel are just regurgitating their own guilt narratives. They've been marinated since birth in lessons about slavery, colonialism and genocide. So they export that self-hatred onto Jews. Isn't that the ultimate moral outsourcing?
Genocide. And so, and as I said in The War on the West, I said this is a very dangerous system that is being set up because it is an unalleviatable guilt that is being put on people. You know, I mean, even if any of the charges were true, nobody alive today is responsible for any of these things. And I said in The War on the West, you know, that this was a very dangerous thing to set people up with a guilt mechanism that had no form of alleviation. And then I think I realized after October 7th that the state of Israel was going to be the perfect mirror for these people. If you are told that you are guilty of genocide, ethnic cleansing, white supremacy, racism, and so on, then what do you do about it? And the answer is, I will find a state I can accuse of doing that now and scream and holler and demonstrate and much more against that state, which is actually just a projection mechanism for the things I've been told I'm guilty of.
And all we need is the existential vacuum as well. And then
exactly.
Together they work perfectly well, don't they?
For me, this was a very important moment of recognition, and I've ever since I first saw that, saw through that, I just kept an eye open, and everywhere and always it's the same. And of course, the problem for the people who do that is it's worth always reminding them is the Jewish people do not exist as a projection mechanism for your own failings.
Now, you speak briefly towards the end of the book about your own family. You mentioned your grandmother, who had family members in 1914, again in 1939, going to war. She loses her father and her brother in war.
Murray's hammer drops. The West built a guilt machine with no off switch. Kids born decades after empire are told they're walking war crimes, racist, colonialist, genocidal. That kind of shame demands an outlet. So they point at Israel like a cosmic scapegoat. It's a psychological laundromat. Dump your inherited sins on Jews and feel pure. But here's the punchline. Jews aren't your therapy project. Isn't that projection weaponized?
I've been watching you for many years right now. And sometimes when I read your books, I'm reminded of the writings of Paul Johnson in The Intellectuals. And other times I'm reminded of Winston Churchill, who from the early 30s was virtually alone amongst British politicians in warning that Hitler's Germany posed an existential danger to Europe. I'm so fascinated by you, Douglas. Where did your values come from? You keep speaking out, I believe, endangering yourself in Israel from bullets from Hamas, and I could even say leftists from the BBC. So who inspires you? Where's your strength and determinism coming from?
I think it's probably lots of things. I'm probably not very good at analyzing myself. I think it's many things. I mean, one is, I suppose, inevitably, I mean, my religious upbringing, definitely, being instilled with good Christian values, I think definitely helped. Being very aware of and loving the culture from which I came, and wanting it to continue and do well and be added to rather than pulled down. I think probably a rarer thing, though, is being able to hold your own even if you're the only person doing it. And I'm not entirely sure where that came from, other than that I've always admired people who could do that in the past. That
holding your own in spite of your environment,
and that peer pressure, or I don't want to walk with a crowd. Like I don't need or desire to walk in lockstep with a crowd.
Murray basically shrugs off the hero worship and answers like a man who knows his spine was built, not bought. Christian ethics, a love for Western culture, and an allergy to mobs. Those are his roots. He's not interested in blending into the Twitter herd or the BBC chorus, like Churchill shouting into a void. He'd rather stand alone than kneel in a crowd. So, any thoughts on what Douglas Murray just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of our future debates.